Good afternoon. I hope you can all hear me both in the room and online. My name is Roy Kennedy. I'm the treasurer of the Fabian Society. I'm the opposition chief whip in the House of Lords, and it's great to be with you all here today. Now, we've got a really interesting session for us all here today. And I'm just going to introduce the panel to us all. And then we're going to ask each of the panel members to address us for up to 5 minutes. And then it's over to yourselves for questions, both in the room and online. But can I make a plea right at the start? That's called question time, not speech time. And if you give speeches, all you mean is that your colleagues in the room can't ask their question. So please respect your colleagues and actually ask questions and not give us speeches, okay? If I just introduce the panel to you, online we've got Daniel Johnson MSP. Daniel is a member of the Scottish Parliament. He's been a member for Edinburgh Southern since 2016, and I actually did go out knocking on doors to Daniel with George Fawkes when he got elected. And Daniel is the spokesperson on financing the economy for the Scottish Labour Party, and he's one of our speakers. We then got Andras Biro-Nagy, Director of the Policy Solutions of Hungary, and Andras previously worked for the European Commission, for the Commissioner for Employment. And thank you for being with us. We then got Professor Daphne Halikiopoulou, who is the Professor of Comparative Politics at the University of Reading, and she's done work that's focused on far-right populism, nationalism and extremism. We have Kirsty McNeill. Kirsty is the Executive Director for Policy, Advocacy and Campaigns to Save the Children, and previously was a Special Advisor to Gordon Brown when he was Prime Minister. And we have Sunder, who runs a think tank, Britain's Future, and looks at issues such as immigration, integration, race and identity. And before that, of course, he's known to us all as the director of the Fabian Society for many years. So we'll start off, first of all, I'll ask Daniel to address us. Over to you, Daniel.
Well, thank you very much, Roy. And I guess I should actually probably begin by thank you for knocking on all of those doors, and each and every one of them is very much valued, having been returned on an increased majority last year. So thank you very much. And I have to say, I'm beginning my remarks with a degree of trepidation. First and foremost, being the first speaker with people like Sunder and Kirsty to follow is first of all daunting, and secondly, speaking as a Scottish Labour politician, there's a sense in which if I knew the answers to populism and dealing with nationalist parties, I would be speaking to you as the finance minister, not shadow finance spokesperson. So basically I'm saying I'm going to be contradicted probably, and I'm probably wrong. But look, let me begin, let me make a few observations about, I think, populism, and try and address some of the questions we were set in the brief. First of all, I think there's a health warning that comes with this, is that I think we need to be careful about making the distinction between populist and popular politics. And indeed, a few weeks ago, I was doing some research on Tony Blair's 1999 conference speech, the famous Forces of Conservatism one. And what I found was William Hague's speech from that year. And what's fascinating about it is his whole narrative through that speech was essentially that Labour politics was vacuous and populist. And in a sense, he was right. And if you think about the last Labour government, some of the enduring things that you remember from that are the slogans like education, 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 tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. And ultimately what we were doing, we created a popular politics that tapped into something deeper. And there's a sense in which the claim of populism is, echoes down the ages of parties who are in decline or not in ascendancy, and is a constant critique. However, I think that's a health warning because things are different. And especially when I'm looking at Scotland, we have a lot of the symptoms. We have a different politics. And the fundamental context is that we have a much more fragmented political dialogue, both in terms of media fragmentation, but also people's identities. So we don't see people, I think, acting and deliberating politically in the same way. And what we see from that is a politics that is very much rooted in identity, that speaks much more to sentiment, than ideology or underlying political theory. And it manifests itself in terms of soundbite. And we see that in Scotland. We see a Scottish government that very much roots itself in its identity of being Scottish, that deflects hugely by appeals to identity. And ultimately, what that means for an opposition party is that it's very difficult to get political purchase because they reach beyond the rational and into the sentimental, into identity. And I think it's a particular problem for the left, because the left has a tendency towards intellectualization, towards theorizing, rather than in terms of sentiment and emotion. And indeed, I think even in the speaker brief, it talks about the overarching brief that we've been given is that this conference will debate the left's ambitions as we seek to rebuild our societies and economies after the pandemic and prepare for green transition and digital transformation. Now, I bet if you walked out onto the street and asked people what are the most important things and what you are wanting to hear from politicians as you think about the future, that's not how they would describe it. They describe it about the fear and uncertainty they have about the future of their work, their frustration about their environment around them, their concerns about the future of their children and how, whether they'll get a good education and, whether or not they will have a comfortable retirement. These are the sorts of things, very much immediate things. And frankly, the left needs to, I think about that context, learn from our successes in the past. And by all means, I think, we have to provide an alternative to populism, but ultimately we're not going to do that through intellectual, theoretical, politics. We need to learn the lessons of the past and root our agenda very much in sentiment so that we have ideas that address absolutely those things, but I think express themselves that in both people's hopes and fears, in terms of their identities, and that's exactly what we have done when we've been successful in the past. I think if you look at certainly the Labour Party's success as it rose to government in the 90s and its sort of successful period in its first two terms, it did that extremely successfully to the point where I think we can all repeat the slogans, understand, remember the sentiments, and ultimately, I think the roots of that also led to some substantial changes in our society, whether that was things like the minimum wage, devolution, the substantial changes we made to child poverty, and the enduring legacy of the public service investment. So we can do this, but we need to actually almost learn the lessons from our opponents and use those features to our own advantage. And I should probably finish here. I think that's about 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm going to move straight on to our next speaker, and I'll ask Daphne to speak to us.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. This is my first in-person event in a really long time, so I'm really pleased. I had a PowerPoint for you, but apparently I can't show it, so I'll sort of describe it. I have some quick data that's not to bore you. I am an academic, so I'll speak like an academic, but that's not to bore you, but it's rather to show you that everything I want to talk about today is actually evidence-based. So if anybody wants to email me, it is available. Now, I'm really happy to be on this panel on populism, nationalism, and division, because this is what I do for a living. And I want to address two questions in particular in my very short talk. The one is, are these, I'm going to focus on right-wing populist movements, are they a challenge? Do they continue to gain ground today? And second, how should the left confront them? Now, throughout, I'm going to actually argue that the reason why people vote for this is it's a multifaceted phenomenon. It's not just about culture and immigration. So actually the idea that we need to mimic the right in terms of its nationalist and anti-immigration policies in order to gain ground is not a good one. It's not a good strategy, and we shouldn't be going along this route. So just very briefly to give you the broad picture, both in the UK and in Europe as a whole, this phenomenon is indeed a challenge. If you look, I had a nice graph to show you how both the center left and the center right party families have been declining in the past sort of 30, 40 years, whereas the right-wing populist party family has been on the increase. Now I also have another graph that shows you that right-wing populist parties in the UK have declined. UKIP, for example, isn't getting much, but that's partly because many center parties are mimicking the right, and they're sort of kind of co-opting this ground themselves. So right-wing populism is indeed becoming far more mainstream. I would outline 3 ways in which right-wing populism is successful. First, in terms of electoral performance, but second, in terms of the breakdown of the cordon sanitaire. Many more right-wing populist parties in Europe are now in government or junior coalition partners. And third, and most worryingly, center parties are co-opting their policy platforms. Now, is this the right way to go? I've done a lot of work recently with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung looking into the voter profiles of these right-wing populist parties. Indeed, the likelihood of someone voting for the far right increases if they, for example, have strong concerns against immigration. So looking at the UK, we found that a person who is older, who comes from a bottom income group, who is a service worker, a rural dweller, and has high immigration concerns, is indeed 13% likely to vote for right-wing populism, for example. Does this therefore mean that a lot of people then take this and say, bingo, immigration is the problem, people have more identity concerns, more cultural concerns over immigration, therefore this is what we need to address? And I say, well, I think this is half the story, because we don't only need to look at the likelihood of someone voting for a particular party, but also the distribution of particular voters with concerns among the broader electorate. So while indeed people who have cultural issues with immigration are more likely to vote for radical right-wing populism, they are very few. If you look at their numerical distribution, they're actually very few. Now, I've done a lot of work. Again, I was going to show you a nice graph here showing that even among the right-wing populist electorate in the UK, 1/3 of the people who voted for, say, UKIP or even the BNP across time had no immigration concerns at all. Therefore, this is more a multifaceted phenomenon. There are other reasons why people vote for these parties. And indeed, what these parties have done to become successful is they've managed to use a rhetoric that is appealing to a broad sector of the population. So they have gone beyond their secure voting base, addressing people also with significant economic concerns. I should also say that my nice graph here shows that beyond those who have no immigration concerns, among those who do in the far right in the right-wing populist electorate, many have economic concerns. So it's an economic narrative that actually captures them. What does this mean now for the left, and what should we do to address these? Again, what I've done to answer this question is a nice comparison between the center-left electorates and the right-wing populist electorates. 3 main points to note here. The first is these electorates are actually quite different. So the center-left people, they really don't have cultural concerns over immigration. Someone with cultural concerns over immigration is really unlikely, someone with no cultural concerns over immigration, sorry, is really unlikely to vote for a party that will talk a lot about this identity and steer their narrative towards a more nationalist rhetoric. Second point is that even, as I said earlier, among the right-wing populist electorate, individuals with cultural concerns of immigration are quite few. This tells us that the shift between voting between parties can go the other way, right? So instead of us thinking that if we adopt a nationalist narrative, then people will come to us for that way, then maybe we can just increase the economic narrative to address people with economic discontent. The German example of the recent elections, if you're familiar, is a really good example of that happening. So I had a final graph to conclude. If the left, based on my analysis, co-opts the right, what's going to happen is they're going to gain very few right-wing voters, but they're going to leak many of their own, those who have no cultural concerns over immigration and who are not attracted by this type of narrative. So co-optation actually doesn't work, and the SPD shows that very well. Instead, what I think the left should do is actually try to gain voters utilizing an issue it already owns, and that issue is equality, based on a narrative that focuses on equality and understanding that economic concerns are actually very broad among the population. They're not niche. And actually, relative deprivation is an issue that is a problem for many voters. I think that is the right way to go, and I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Daphne. Go straight on now.
Thanks very much. It's always nice to be back with the Fabians, General Secretaries 2003 to 2011. I'm sure there were several of the similar debates, but the world has changed in so many ways. Nobody had heard of Brexit or COVID or Jeremy Corbyn or Boris Johnson probably was on the seat. But, you know, the world has changed in many ways, but you'll continue to grapple with the important challenges for the future. I now run a think tank called British Future, which is a charity, so it's non-partisan. It will come to the Fabian Society and talk to you all. It will talk to other political tribes too about the way we deal with these issues of identity, these challenges of what divides us, what unites us, and so on. So I'd love to think about a few things. One was, you know, are populists on the rise or on the wane? How does the left respond? How does it reach? How does it reach out? And also the question which Daniel was also joking about is the kind of national challenge in Scotland different or similar to the sort of right-wing populisms that we see? So we've got a lot to tell you about. I think the overall thing about a comparative conversation, I think it's very useful, is that you can learn and exchange and you can illuminate your own national context. But I think trends are global and continental wide. You have pandemics and financial crises and migration flows and technology changes and, you know, the education population. So there's similar trends in Britain and Germany and France and other countries to some extent in America, but these are different contexts. So I think politics is national and local, and you can illuminate your own politics by looking at the differences. So I don't think there are any solutions that work across the piece. And so the answer, are people on the rise or the wane? It just differs. They're very different political cycles. If you had a referendum on the European Union and left it, you're now in a very different political context. Britain is quite a middling country for cultural conflict. It might not feel like that after the 5 or 6 years that we've had with referendums on the UK and referendums on Europe and general elections every 5 minutes. You know, there might be another one, who knows? But Britain is quite middling on cultural conflict. We are a much more divided society by identity that we have tended to think that we are in Britain. We've learned that, and, you know, that was pretty clear at the end of the Brexit referendum, if you hadn't known that before, that people who went to university, people who didn't go to university, people who live in citizen towns, you know, older and younger people have different views about what these political questions are about. So we're more divided than we were. One of the lessons the last couple of years, I think, has been a reminder that we're less divided sometimes than we think, that we're telling ourselves. The first lockdown, when we were all obeying the rules, as of course we should continue to do so, you know, about 97% of us agreed on those lockdowns. When people first heard of vaccines, 2/3 of people thought they sounded like a good idea. Other people had questions. 9 out of 10 people took them. You can hear a lot from, you know, the 3% of people who are not going to take them, and still people are hesitant. But there's more consensus in British society on some very fundamental questions, but that underlines some other things that we've continued to agree on while we disagree about politics. The NHS is something that is foundationally important to people. Not everybody agrees with the monarchy, but a lot of people do. Remembrance brings people together. So Britain has a lot of shared cultural capital. Britain is a bit different in this respect to America and to France, where there are less shared points of contact for people who disagree across politics. That's dangerous. So in France, if somebody tells you what they think of the vaccine pass, you know quite a lot about their politics. You don't know everything about their politics. If you know if it's a Macron supporter, they're like it. You won't be able to tell if it's a populist right Zemmour supporter or Mélenchon supporter if they're sympathetic to the anti-pass. But it's quite heavily connected. Whether you wear a face mask or not in America, you might as well be putting your ballot paper on your face, actually. Because it is absolutely, in America, who got vaccinated, who didn't get vaccinated, it's not about ethnicity or class nearly so much as it's about politics And, you know, in this case, certain types of populism cost lives, because people in highly based Republican states where the idea of the vaccine and COVID restrictions is so unpopular that people haven't done it, the death rates are higher. So that's very dangerous and very sad. We haven't got that in Britain. And I sometimes think that some of our newspapers, some of our tweeters, some of our political commentators, radio stations don't know that it's different. So politics doesn't divide you very much on Brexit. It does in the House of Commons, but it doesn't in the country. There's a sociological reason for that, which is that older people have been very, very cautious about COVID. And it was older people who are more likely to vote Conservative, more likely to vote Brexit. They've been the most pro-restrictions most of the time. So that cuts out this attempt to import the culture war. Basically, old people in Britain have been much too sensible, much too cautious to want a culture war about COVID because they thought it was a public health issue. Some of the left voters, the younger people, have been more sceptical about whether they should be cooped up. They might not have gardens and big houses to work from home in, etc. So people haven't noticed that it hasn't been a political issue there. So more unites us, even when we're quite fractious, perhaps, than we think. The last thing I'll say in my opening 5 minutes, much more that we'll get into, and Kirsty will help us call off culture wars, which is very much where I am, but you have to call them off on the basis of values, not just on the basis of the votes and the electoral coalitions you want. And I think there's a real dilemma on the left between, if I'm talking to voters who don't agree with me, am I selling out my causes and my principles, my votes? I think we have to talk that through, work that out. I think Daniel's speaking for Scotland with much more authority than I will have. The question of if it's different there is very, very different. Scotland, and I think it doesn't help us to argue with the sort of imaginary opposition. You know, I think there are xenophobes in Scotland who support independence and xenophobes who support the Union on the flank, but there are Remain voters for the SNP and for independence, and Remain voters for the UK, you know, who might have a lot more culturally in common with each other. So I think it's a complex picture. I think if you've got a civic left-wing nationalism, it's also populist, it's a very different thing. And we, you know, you're sort of imagining the opponents that you like because of, you know, what maybe Scottish nationalism was about in the 1970s before the 1990s won't help you win the argument for the United Kingdom that, you know, Labour Party and Unionists will want to put forward in this area.
Thank you, Sunder. We'll go straight now to Kirsty.
Thanks, Roy. And I think one of the reasons I've been invited today is because last year I published with a fellow author who's in the audience, a Fabian pamphlet on the culture wars called Counterculture. And in that pamphlet, we invited readers, and I'd invite all of you to answer this question too, of do you primarily think your role in politics is to win a culture war or to end one? And our conclusion was that it is inconceivable that the right answer for us as Democrats in the round, as people who believe that we share a common state and that we have fates that are bound with one another. So even at just the most basic level as Democrats, but particularly as progressives, it is obvious to us when we were writing that division and polarization are not friends to us. They're not friends to Democrats, they're not friends to progressives. But as Sunder has alluded to, one of the reasons that Labour people find that conclusion agonising is because they think they are being invited to choose between their values and their voters. And I understand why, if that was the choice, that would feel completely agonising for people with values-based conviction politics that's rooted in progress for society. But what we concluded at the end of our research was that's a false choice, and it is actually possible, albeit hard. And I'll explain a little about how it might be possible. It is possible to have both a winning and principled strategy that's based in building solidarity, but it's solidarity across lines of difference. So it will involve building a coalition that is multiracial, that is cross-class, and that is intergenerational. But before we're able to build that and do the hard yards of building that electoral coalition, we really need to be clear with ourselves what is going on. So what is the situation that we're in with these so-called culture wars? And our conclusion at the end of our research is that the culture wars are real, but not authentic. And what we meant by that is they are real insofar as they dominate our front pages, they dominate our lives online, they dominate some of the debates in the House of Commons, but they're not real in the sense that our neighbourhoods and workplaces and communities are not writhen with fights about flags or statues or defunding the police. That's not the conversation that we are having in our country. So they're not authentic insofar as our conclusion is that for the most part, they are orchestrated. And we diagnose that they're orchestrated sometimes for money, so sometimes pure grifting, pure financial gain, Sometimes the culture wars are orchestrated to improve the reach or political reputation with a base of some of the people who are at the forefront of them. And sometimes they're orchestrated for raw political advantage. And our diagnosis there was not because we had uncovered something that senior Conservatives were not saying for themselves. We've actually had plenty of senior Conservatives break cover and say in public that they are incredibly uncomfortable about the strategy that's being pursued around stoking division for electoral gain. But it's also fair to say that it is an absolutely rational electoral strategy for the Conservatives. And the reason I say that is because the function of the culture wars is clear. It's to divide communities, it's to divide the left against itself, it's to divide the left from communities by putting us beyond the pale of so-called common sense. And it distracts the public as a whole from very real conversations that aren't just about the economy, although I would argue primarily should be, but there are other serious conversations that we need to have about heritage, history, values, and culture, but we are not able to get into them for every minute that we're debating statues. So it's a perfectly rational strategy, but we issued an invite to Conservatives in the report to say, you have a choice to make, and it's, do you believe that the electoral gain is worth the societal pain? Because clearly there is societal pain when people are invited to not trust one another, and when solidarity between our four nations and between communities in our four nations is strained. So that's the question that we would ask in good faith to Conservative friends who are worried about the direction of travel and the political strategy of their government. The question for Labour people is different, and I think we should focus on this here at the Fabian Society. It's, are you willing to do the hard yards and make the difficult choices that is involved in building genuine 21st century solidarity? And we diagnose that there's a 4-point path to how you might go about doing that. And I don't say this in any sense to imply that this is easy, but we did conclude this is the only choice available to the progressive family in the round, not just the Labour Party, but its allies and outriders too. The first pillar of that strategy would be to diversify the movement. And what we mean by that is sometimes these debates become particularly aggressive because you have people ventriloquizing other people's thoughts. You have people saying red wall voters won't wear this, that, or the other, when they couldn't be further demographically from being red wall voters themselves. You have people saying the Black community believes the following, when we could be having Black community leaders speaking for themselves. So diversifying the movement takes the heat out of some of these debates because people speak about their genuine concerns in a way that isn't exacerbated or exaggerated or caricatured by others. Secondly, we need a willingness to do the role of sense making on the part of elected representatives. And what we mean by that is you have to call out the culture war stoking as it occurs. Now, you have to do that with deftness, and it won't be the case in every case that a debate about identity or culture is stoking the culture war. But when it is, Labour leaders have to have the confidence to say so, and the confidence that the listener, the viewer, the voter will be able to recognise it, because the great British public is not, despite what the government may seem to think this week, is not daft. Thirdly, there has to be a willingness amongst progressives to put democracy first and say that whatever we believe about a partisan affiliation, whatever we believe about our policy preferences are second order concerns compared to the fact that we are Democrats first and foremost. And that will have implications for the kind of policy agenda, legislative agenda and regulatory agenda that a future Labour government would pursue around, for example, the regulation of technology and social media. But it also draws on us to have a democratic habit of mind. And what I mean by that is you should never, as a progressive, be drawn into caricaturing, dehumanizing, denigrating your political opponents. Just beat them fair and square on the arguments. That's what having a democratic habit of mind means to me. And fourthly, it requires a plausible path to future economic abundance. So growth and equality happening side by side. as you might have it as an old Brownite, how are we going to redistribute the proceeds of growth? But it does require a plausible path to that. And both sides of that equation are equally important. It's not about having the most radical policy prospectus. It's about having the most radical policy prospectus that people believe you can genuinely implement, and they believe in both your motivation and your capability to do so. So I think there's a 4-point path available to progressives if they choose to take it. And I would end by saying, I do not think this is easy. And when I've been asked before about why this hasn't happened, I've had to answer, it's because it requires a once in a generation political talent to pull it off. So if this was incredibly easy and didn't require political insight and emotional deftness of a magnitude that is Barack Obama on steroids, we'd have done it already. It's incredibly hard to do this strategy, but it is, I believe, the only path to victory that is simultaneously a winning one and a principled one. So it's hard, but it is, in my view, possible, and it's absolutely imperative.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kirsty. And our final speaker now is Andras.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. It's indeed an honor to be here on this panel. And one of the key questions of this panel that was given to us in the speaker's brief has been whether political movements that are nationalists and increase division in societies continue to gain ground across Europe, or they start to lose momentum. And I believe that the right answer for this, from a Central and Eastern European view that I'm representing here, is that in 3 months' time we will be much wiser, as 2 crucial elections are coming up this spring, one of them in Hungary, in my home country, the other one in Slovenia. These 2 governments are representing exactly what Daphne has just mentioned. These governments are the concrete examples of how right-wing populism became mainstream and then got into power. And in Hungary, what I can tell you, because the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán is probably the #1 troublemaker in European politics nowadays, now a united opposition stands a real chance of beating the illiberal strongman of Hungary for the first time in 15 years. Exactly based on a unified strategy, which is built on that all participants are Democrats first and foremost, as it was mentioned previously as a potential way forward. In Hungary, this is what the opposition is currently trying to do against Viktor Orbán's ruling party. The reason why I'm underlining these 2 elections that are coming up in the region is that because a change in these 2 governments would significantly improve the situation in the rule of law crisis in Europe, as 2 out of the 3 main troublemakers will be out of the system. And also there is another ongoing trend, which is about the realignment of the far right in European politics, in the European Parliament exactly. There has been ongoing negotiations between the formerly Tory-led ECR political group, which is currently led by the Poles, and the Italians, Salvini's Lega, and the Identity and Democracy group. And Viktor Orbán tries to participate as a key player in this process to realign and unite the far right at the European level. So, of course, a defeat at the Hungarian elections would be a significant blow to this whole process. What nationalist populism in this region, in general in the Visegrad region, has brought to us is polarization at an extreme level, even by European standards. And this became a polarization and increased division between different age groups, between different groups of educational background, and also between urban and rural population. Currently, the right-wing nationalists, right-wing populists in the region, from Poland to Hungary, are overrepresented among older people, overrepresented among lower educated segments of the society, and overrepresented among the rural population, which also means that the left and the opposition normally in these countries are overrepresented in the bigger cities, especially in the capital cities, from Warsaw to Prague to Budapest. This is completely true among higher educated segments of the society and among younger voters. And I believe that these trends are not unfamiliar to our British friends either within the society. And why is this important from a left-wing perspective? It's important because what we see is that because of these transformational trends in the society, the left has lost quite a lot of its traditional supporters among pensioners, among older segments of the society, and also among lower educated segments of the society. And of course, the bigger question is how to win them back. And in order to say a few words about it, we have to see the values of these people. And what we see there is that they are primarily culturally conservative, but economically left-wing. So my general advice for this region and for our friends in Europe as well would be that what really matters in this respect is what politics is about. Whether is it about the cultural identity fights, or if it's about the socio-economic aspects of politics. So I just would like to underline what two previous colleagues have already mentioned here. Co-optation is not a strategy, clearly not in this region. It already turned out, based on our experience in the migration issue over the last 5 or 6 years, it doesn't work. But a strategy based on solidarity and a strategy based on equality, based on cost of living issues, based on issues of inflation, of social mobility, are clearly issues that the progressive parties own and in which they have an advantage if politics is about these issues. So here, I think there is a big clash between narratives, and whoever wins the fight for dominating the narrative and the political agenda has a much better chance at future elections as well. This is what we see here in the region, and I hope this has been helpful for our British friends as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Andras. I think we've had 5 really interesting, informative, challenging and actually inspiring contributions from our panelists. We're now going to move on to question time. I said it's question time, not speech time. I'll take 3 questions in the room here. Then I don't think we can take questions online as well, can we? Possibly, okay. So I've got plenty of hands up here. So I'll take questions, groups of 3. Colleague there. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, well, I'll pick that first. Right. Colleague there, and then the woman there, the black dress, that woman there in the top there. Okay.
One characteristic of populism is that it's hostile to any form of constitutional or human rights check on the powers of politicians. How on the left does one defend human rights, the idea of constitutional checks and balances, the idea of scrutiny of government decision-making against that challenge, bearing in mind what Kirsty said, that we are Democrats first? George Peretz.
Take 3 questions.
Yeah, sorry. Hi, it's Carly Donovan. So I think, Kirsty, the stuff that you talked about made a huge amount of sense in terms of how do you actually deal with some of these challenges around cultural wars. But I think there's also a huge amount of bravery that's needed to follow those steps, because there's a real fearfulness in, diversifying voices or defending democratic values. So how do we all contribute to creating an environment that actually mitigates some of that fear and allows for those values to be defended?
Geraldine, this question specifically for Daphne, but I don't mind the others answering. It's more, where do you think this comes from? I often wonder if it comes from a place of, we see our society changing, we see things failing, and then things like right-wing populism comes up with things like easy answers to blame. If we see things like economic destruction and stuff like that, and then right-wing populism comes along with an easy answer. So I'm basically wondering about the causes of this, of where it all comes from. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go around the panel. If I start with Kirsty, first of all.
Thank you. So I think this question about how do we go about defending democracy, I think it's probably got three parts, and the third is relevant to the second colleague's question about bravery. So I think we have to be willing, were there to be a future Labour government that is coming in with the kind of goodwill and momentum that a fresh government always has, we have to be willing to say things that Labour people have traditionally not said, like hooray for lawyers and judges, right? Like the rule of law has guardians, and some of those guardians are very popular. On the left, they are protesters and activists, but some of them are also people in the legal system, and Labour governments historically have not been quite as full-throated in defence of the guardians of the rule of law as they might have been. So let's take on some of those myths about what is happening in our legal and judicial system. So I think we should be willing to take on the unpopular sort of producer interests as it might have been characterised by a previous Labour government, as well as the more popular elements. Secondly, I think there's a policy agenda that follows, and this is a pure question of political and governing strategy about how quickly should we move to remove some of the civic space restrictions that have been introduced by the government, and how quickly should we move on social media and tech regulation. And my own view is that is a first order priority for a future Labour government, in the same way that in the United States, the question about whether filibuster reform is the first priority and defending voting rights is the first order priority, because it's a foundation on which all else relies. I would argue that increasing civic space and respect for pluralism is a first order priority for a future Labour government, and not a second term or second order kind of priority. And thirdly, I think there's something for us, and this goes to the colleague's question about bravery, I think there's something for all of us to think about our own agency in setting culture inside either a party of which we're a member or progressive movements of which we are parts. We have to sanction behaviour that we do not consider to be in line with our values. And it's fantastic that the deputy leader apologised for calling her opponents scum. It is not progressive behaviour to denigrate or dehumanise your opponents by calling them scum, by saying you're going to lynch them, or any of the other forms of dehumanising language that have characterised politics over the last few years, but which I'm afraid are found on the left as much as on the right. And we have to be willing to sanction that and say that is not how we roll. That's just not an appropriate way to behave inside a progressive movement that's about the fundamental equality of all human beings. And if you believe that everyone is equal, that has to include people that are wrong.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to come to Sunder, and then I'm going to come to Andras, and then on to Daniel.
Great. Well, George asked a really good question. I've met George twice, I think, at Fabian conferences, but he's a great source of information and expertise online if you're not following him, because he's a very eminent legal mind, and therefore he may be part of the problem for the question that he puts to us. So it's a really serious question, especially you might see political change about, you know, Conservative Party might choose a new Prime Minister before there's a general election. Might the Human Rights Act come under pressure? I think it will. Might you need to defend it? And what did you learn from the loss of the Brexit referendum about how to defend and how not to defend the Human Rights Act? And so we don't need to convince QCs and lawyers of the importance of the rule of law. They will very vocally say it, and you know that will be useful, but they might not be the only messages. We probably don't need to convince that many members of the Fabian Society to join this side of the argument if the Human Rights Act is at stake. But we will need to convince, say, people who didn't go to university, to take a description of 3/4 of the population, as well as graduates. And so Daniel's challenge to, you know, the Fabian Society and the Fabian members, you know, very good at talking policy, very good at talking policy in broadsheet to graduates. And if you restricted the franchise to graduates, which of course you shouldn't, you'd have won the Brexit referendum about 3-1, but not able, I think, to communicate about emotion, identity. What is the argument about the Human Rights Act about? It's about who gets protected, who doesn't, power, sovereignty, politics, and so on. And so if you want to start from a position if you don't already agree with us, you're a terribly dangerous person who probably wants Orban's Hungary or it to be 1933 again, then you are only ever going to talk to people you don't need to convince. And I think that reducing the social distance and being able to communicate about the progressive causes and values you've got to all of the people campaigning for those issues that went to university and all the people who didn't is probably the biggest test for the left in crossing cultural divides.
Thank you. Can I ask Andras to please a contribution?
Yes, and answering now, I would also address a question that is directly addressed to me in the chat, which is about if the far right in Hungary is also part of the unified opposition to Viktor Orban's Fidesz party, and how can left and far right work together against leaders like Orban? And to this question, my answer would be that in some parts of Europe, now the question is not how to defend the checks and balances. The question is how to restore them, because we haven't been able to defend it over the last decade, apparently. And in order to restore democracy, liberal democracy and checks and balances, basically all stakeholders from the left through liberal parties and green parties to the formerly far-right Jobbik party, they all join their forces and try to beat Orban. So to the question, it is a yes, that even the formerly far-right Jobbik party is part of the unified opposition in Hungary. And surprisingly, they can do quite well when it comes to establish a national minimum against the ruling party and the ruling elite. And this national minimum is to be pro-European instead of being pro-Russia or pro-China, for example. It is being green, which apparently unites everybody from the conservative side to the left in Hungary currently. And we also promote a more socially just policy in the joint manifesto. So the way forward is to at least find those minimums in the society that bind these different voting groups together and try to build an alternative against an anti-democratic regime. So what I have mentioned to you is that here the dividing line is that we have an anti-democratic leadership that is building an authoritarian regime, and all the other players are able to put aside their differences and put democracy and their democratic attitudes first and foremost. So this is the way forward in such a dangerous situation.
Thank you. Can I ask Daniel now, please?
Yeah, thank you. Look, I mean, a really interesting set of questions, and I actually think there's some points that links them. But I mean, let me begin by pointing out that this hostility and the undermining of constitutional checks isn't an exclusive to the sort of nationalist from the right. I think that while I don't think that is a primary objective or purpose of nationalists in Scotland, what you do see is the use of identity, of kind of national values and arguments being used to undermine those institutions when they do not serve the purpose of the nationalist agenda, the overarching agenda of securing separation. And we have seen that time and time again in Scotland, where essentially those arguments are evoked when they no longer serve the agenda of the governing party here. But I think moreover, there are arguments to, and I think the thing that links all of this together is I think and this is what also I think links the first question to the latter two, is that I think sometimes on the left, in the progressive side of politics, we assume we don't have the alternative sentiments or values or identities to appeal to, and I think that we do. And I think one of the interesting things in Britain is that we don't necessarily champion the constitution that we have as much as we might, but we have a strong tradition of democracy, a respect for individual rights, a flourishing tradition of freedom of speech, and these are powerful, enduring values of British culture that transcend, not just the nations of these islands, but are recognized internationally. And we should have the courage to actually tap into those and articulate them. And it's where we move beyond simply, arguing for individual elements of those, about the individual structures and the theories and so on, but actually the overarching values that those institutions and those measures enshrine. And I think they are there, and I think we need to be a bolder in articulating our alternative sentiment, our alternative values, our alternative identities to those that are being pursued by the right. And I think what Kirsty is saying, I think, is actually particularly important. I think we need to be really clear about the things that we need to do to entrench those when we do get into power. And I think there's a very clear parallel to what we did. And indeed, Kirsty was confessing to be an unreconstructed, I don't think that was her term, but an unapologetic brown knight, and let me be one too. What we did, within days of coming to power, of giving independence to the Bank of England, setting in motion the referendum on the Scottish Parliament and devolution, we acted very, very quickly to entrench the sorts of things that were important to us, both in terms of institutions through our period of governing, but also to very powerfully signal the things that were important to us, both in terms of economic competence, but also in terms of devolving power, giving power down as close to people as possible. So I think having that clear agenda, and I think being clear about what we need to do and what we need to do quickly, I think is really important.
Thank you, Daniel. I'll move on now to the next group of questions. Who'd like to ask a question? Lots of people there. Got the woman just there. Okay, guess you yourself. Then chap there, and then Ben there, the back there, right?
If you guys could just keep your hands up, that would be great. I'll try. My name is Christabel. A couple of the speakers mentioned that redistributing economic growth could be one solution to the divisions that we're facing. However, we're probably about to enter a period where there's going to be very little economic growth. So it's going to be about taking from one group and giving to another. How do we manage that without further exacerbating division?
My name's Nathaniel. I wanted to just ask the panel if there was any lessons for the rest of the UK in terms of the situation in Wales, in terms of how the Welsh Labour Party has been able to forge a sense of left-wing nationalism that isn't separatist.
Hi, I'm Ben West. The pandemic seems to have sort of over the past couple of years shown the kind of the slight peculiarity and perhaps unsustainability of the UK's kind of constitutional settlement with devolution. We've got sort of it's been remarked on that with all the press the press briefings and so on, we've got a situation where England is the only constituent part of the United Kingdom not to have its own parliament, and we've got the increasingly strange situation of the Prime Minister, insofar as he does the job, double jobbing as both the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and the First Minister perhaps of England. So I wonder what the panel's views were on the role of that constitutional settlement in perhaps driving some of these nationalisms, and particularly English populism and English nationalism, and whether there's any mileage in an English Parliament.
Thank you for those, and I'm going to come to Daphne.
Thank you. I'll address your redistribution question because I think that's closest to what I know. I would switch this around and say that the redistribution issue is actually our strength rather than our weakness. And here's why, right? So you're very right to say that the pandemic is actually posing some serious economic problems, and people have serious economic concerns. And as I said earlier, that's not just a question of just one particular class, but it's for everybody, right? Everybody's facing some insecurity. who better than the left can offer answers to this question? So a lot of the populists, and I just very briefly then we'll come to the third question that was posed in the previous round, populism being the easy answer. That's exactly it, right? So populism thrives on this sort of pseudo-democratic narrative of the will of the people. There is no such thing as the unified will of the people. It's actually many different people with many different preferences, often clashing preferences. And when you do come to power, the question is about how to really reconcile these preferences through a proper democratic institutional framework that actually works, right? So I think that indeed the fact that economic concerns are going to become even more salient in the near future gives the left a really good step to actually say, we know better, because this is the issue that we own, right? This is the issue that we know better, how to redistribute wealth in a way that doesn't exclude various people and in a way that actually creates democratic prosperity and stability.
Thank you. Could I ask Daniel if he's able to come in now, please?
Of course. I mean, just to follow on from that, I mean, I very much agree with that. I mean, I think redistribution is a strength, not a weakness. But I think, again, and I'm going to repeat myself a little bit, I think it's about how we describe it and the appeals we make. And, you know, the point about redistribution is that it's important in terms of solidarity, in terms of equality in society. And I think making that appeal by saying, you know, it's about helping your neighbor, about ensuring that we have healthy communities and that no one is left behind. You know, these are the sorts of arguments you need to make. But ultimately, the other critical point around it is that, you know, however we're talking about our economic prospectus, but I think particularly around redistribution, it's about the future. It's about providing a better future for people where they have more security, have better economic prospects, both for themselves, their families, and their communities. And I think that, you know, is how we cast the argument, and that's you know, really important. In terms of the Welsh example, and I think it does. I mean, I think you can balance those appeals to you know, national identity, you know, with a broader left-wing progressive one, and indeed in some ways that's what the SNP do as well. But apart from the, you know, the Labour government, you know, don't believe in secession in Wales. And just to a point around this point around English devolution and the asymmetry of the British state as we see it. Look, that is a fact, and it's not going to go away. I mean, I think even if you created an English parliament, you'd still have a lot of these tensions. I think what we do need to do is have a very, you know, very serious look at constitutional reform. Indeed, I think it's actually, you know, necessary. I think it's a necessary part of any progressive politics that we need to see the constitution, I think, renew and updated when we're in government. But I think it's particularly important now. And I think rather than focus on an English parliament, I think we need to look at the upper house. I think that's ultimately where I think we balance the competing interests of the nations and indeed the city regions. And I don't discount that part of the change that we've had and how important that is. And there's a question here, is that the city's agenda a way of balancing this? And I think absolutely it is. And I think if you look at what Andy Burnham has done in Manchester, you know, I think that he has used his office as mayor to be a real focal point for championing a lot of these things in a lot of the ways that we've been talking about. So I think we need to look at how we can embrace that agenda, deepen it, and I think that a future British state needs to develop those things. And indeed, I think economically too, having the focus at that sort of level is critically important. That actually it's about having healthy city and regional economies is actually how you unlock a lot of the issues and the economic progress that we need to see, whether you're talking about England, Wales, Scotland, or wherever.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to ask now for Andras to make a contribution, then Sunder, and then ask Kirsty to wrap up.
Well, actually, I just would like to underline what Daphne has mentioned before. I think that in times like these, during the pandemic, during the crisis, to focus on issues that address the economic insecurity of people is absolutely vital. And this is the field where the progressive forces could have an advantage, especially in countries where the right-wing populist forces would like to focus all the debate about cultural issues on gender issues, on LGBT, on migration, on family policies, and so on. So just imagine that, for example, in the case of the upcoming Hungarian elections, on the same day, the government organizes a referendum on LGBT rights, because by this, they hope to focus the entire debate about the culture wars around such issues. And this clearly doesn't favor the left wing and progressive forces in such countries. So here the way forward, I believe, is to try to focus all the potential energies on issues like cost of living, on inflation, on social mobility, on solidarity, and so on. It's the economy that should come first, I believe, in the next few months for progressive forces.
Thanks. So it's been good to hear Andras's analysis of the Hungarian situation, and we all wish you and your colleagues, Andras, well in in defending democracy in your country under such pressure. Back in the UK, lessons from Wales. Yes, there's a big lesson from Wales. You don't get to govern a country unless you are confident and comfortable with the symbols of the country that you wish to govern, such as its flag. And Welsh Labour is a very good example of being confident with Welsh identity, Welsh culture, the Welsh nation. Maybe Welsh Labour feels it's shaped a lot of Wales over the decades and centuries, so it's got that. And so there are lessons there. There are lessons for Daniel in Scotland, because the Scottish Labour Party, which will want to keep the United Kingdom, can talk about British identity that is politically polarizing now in this age in Scotland, and it needs to also talk about Scottish identity, which is a shared identity of people who will vote for independence and people who will vote against independence, of course, feel very patriotically Scottish at Hampden Park and Murrayfield, and so you shouldn't concede that. And then there's a challenge as well. So we live in a complex multinational democracy. It's a union of choice. If Scotland had wanted to leave, if majority voted, it would have gone. So you've got to maintain it. So it's democratic union of choice. You've got to talk at all of the elements. The Labour Party will probably be very comfortable about devolving power to Greater Manchester and Birmingham. But what does it have to say about England? Now that's a much less familiar conversation to the public. What kind of devolution? We should recognise England culturally. Mark St. George's Day, talk about it, and then deal with the political questions of how do we scrutinise the education system in England as they do in Wales and Scotland. So I think you shouldn't be scared of that debate. You've got to be comfortable and confident about it. I slightly hoped that the argument the English football team made, and they came under pressure and they held their ground and they shifted the middle. Maybe the England football team, able to shift the middle of England on anti-racism, could shift the middle of the Fabian Society on the Labour Party on being willing to talk about Englishness, even when it's not only about football and racism.
Thank you, Sunder. And now concluding remarks over to Kirsty.
Thanks, Roy. And I'll focus on Christabel's question, if I may. And I've got two thoughts about it. So one is in the report Counterculture, we focus quite a lot on how the framing often of culture war peddlers is precisely the zero-sum framing that you suggested. And there's quite a lot of academic evidence that we cite in the report that actually the thing that's really poisonous with zero-sum and the thing that gives it a particular heat is thwarted entitlement. So it's actually not that some people are losing out, it's that some people are losing out who were brought up expecting not to. And that's when it gets its real fervor. So there's some lessons there about how you help manage people through transitions, that their life is not going to turn out exactly as they expected or had reason to believe. But there's also something there about taking that argument head on and inviting people to ask themselves who benefits from this particular sense, that if someone is gaining, someone has to be losing, because it tends not to be the people who are towards the bottom of the distribution scale who actually benefit from that sense that people on middle or modest incomes are divided amongst themselves, rather than looking at who's actually the agent of my disposition. And it will very rarely be somebody that lives in a neighborhood like yours or kids who are at schools like your kids. It will often be people who are incredibly wealthy who are stoking this by design, so that we're having a conversation about that and not a conversation about cuts to school budgets or cuts to social security, or what has happened to the decent work? Why has wage stagnation been allowed to go on for so long? So I think there's something about inviting people not to consider life as zero sum, but to think about how progressive politics can make life one of positive sum, where we are investing for growth and we are thinking about the jobs of the future. And related to that, I would just really give a shout out to Heather McGee, who is a phenomenal African-American economist who's written a book called The Sum of Us. And it's about what racism costs us all, what it costs people regardless of their racial background when we are divided and squabbling amongst ourselves. And one of the great lessons that I took from that book that I would just invite all Fabians to think about, and it's a particular thing for Fabians to think about, and I say this with so much love as a long-standing member of the society. The thing that she invites us to think about is how we practice our politics differently, so that redistribution and solidarity isn't something that comes purely from a policy perspective implemented by a government. It's something that we build. Solidarity is something that we feel, something that we do, not just something that we talk about. So she really invites us to think about, how do you build that sense of cross-class, multiracial, intergenerational solidarity through organising for redistribution, through winning workplace and neighbourhood victories for ourselves, and not simply waiting for a future government to hand it to us.
Thank you very much. And can I thank, first of all, I thank you all for coming to this workshop. It's been a fantastic session we've had here today. Great questions, really great contributions from everyone on the floor here. If you didn't get a chance to ask a question, I apologise if we run out of time. But also, can I just thank the panel? I think the panel has been fantastic, really wonderful contributions. Can you maybe show their appreciation to the panel today? Thank you all very much. Thank you.